Thanks very much. I really appreciate being invited. This is a terrific group I've heard about for many years from Michael, and so excited to join today. Just maybe a bit of background. So I spent my operating career helping to start two software companies, one with Reed Hastings prior to him doing Netflix, and then the other with Mark Gainey prior to him doing Strava. So we took those companies public. I then spent 20 years as a general partner at a Foundation Capital, which is a top-tier venture firm here in the Silicon Valley, where I am today. And then I joined Mach 49 after being an advisor while I was still at Foundation. So Mach 49 is, the tagline is we're kind of the Y Combinator for the Global 1000. We help large companies with innovation and a word we prefer, which is growth. So we help them by creating venture incubators, by helping them create new ventures. We've built about 80 companies inside the corpus of some of the largest companies and organizations in the world. Companies like Intel and Stanley Black & Decker and Schneider Electric and Hitachi and many others. And then I run a practice for our founder, Linda Yates, who Michael knows quite well, our founder and CEO. I run a practice we call the Venture Investing Practice. We stumbled upon the fact that large corporations were deeply curious about top-tier venture and how it worked as opposed to the traditional, generally less successful corporate venture. And so we invented a new model, basically, where we bring the principles and practices and people of top-tier venture into some of the largest organizations in the world and help them start new venture-related activities. And I would say in the course of that, while at Foundation, I ran the sustainability practice, and in the course of the work that we do at Mach 49, I would say probably plus or minus half the work we do is related to climate tech, the transition to the electric economy, moving away from ICE engines, all that stuff. So it's probably a pretty good fit for the kind of conversation we're going to have today.
Roll up the sleeve.
Okay, so Paul, we're sitting here in the middle of a program where we're talking. Everything is in the frame of digital inclusivity.
Yeah.
N50, as I mentioned in opening remarks, we have almost 100 partner organizations looking to pull together for project implementations, which will have built into their design an accounting for improvements in digital inclusivity. Does the term digital inclusivity come up in your work? Is this actually a thing that has the attention of Silicon Valley, more broadly the private sector? Is it something that has the potential for, as you say, growth or sustainability, if not scale?
Yes, I'd answer that probably in three ways. So in traditional top-tier venture, the goal is to make money. It's not a bad thing. It's a good thing. That traditional venture, Michael's aware, I made a documentary film called Something Ventured about the origins of Silicon Valley and how Apple and Intel and Genentech and Atari and others got funded. So traditional venture has created 5 of the top 10 most valuable companies in the world. It's helped create, some of the most amazing innovations in human history, certainly in the last 50 years. But it's primarily about making money. Now, there are a couple of other sectors of venture. There's corporate venture, as we touched on, and nearly every large corporation, if not every large corporation, has some form of, I would say it kind of broadly, ESG, DEI, digital inclusion, some other greater good type of goals that are associated with what they do. And the higher you get in the organization, the more you hear about those goals. When you go to the boards, you see people applying to become B Corps and others. So that's a thing. And then there's a third element of venture, which I call, kind of the better world folks. So people like Chan Zuckerberg, the Gates Foundation, and others. And that's thanks to the tremendous wealth that's been created for those folks. That's a fast growing part of the business. And I would say digital inclusion, as you all know, because you interact with those people, is one of the primary goals associated with that. So it's really those three elements. So if you walk into a traditional top tier venture firm and say, my goal is to foster digital inclusion, I think you'll get a polite reception, but I think you're going to have better luck in those other two categories.
Okay, so has the positioning of digital inclusivity perceptively shifted as it relates to pitches that are being made for new projects, new companies that are setting out to make money?
Yeah, so I'd say where that is going to occur, and that used to be almost unheard of. Over the last 10 years, you've seen more expansion of venture into areas where large swaths of the population don't have access to digital technology in any form, or at least not consistently. So, obviously the explosion of venture and related activity across China, the explosion across India and the Indian subcontinent, but now, pretty significant inroads in Africa, certainly in the MENA region, Middle East and North Africa. The digital inclusion kind of thing, it's pretty broadly available from that perspective. We have interactions with Airtel, one of the large mobile players, and they have over 100 million customers in Nigeria, for example. So there's a lot more of that going on. There are actually successful venture funded startups coming out of those regions that are starting to get noticed from that perspective. But I say all that as, I would think of that as, especially in the areas that are not traditionally served by ventures, sort of outside China and India. It's kind of a green shoots phenomenon. It's not broadly applicable at this point, but where we see it coming in primarily in two forms that at least are where venture is paying attention. One is in broadly what I would call mobile communications and mobile applications, so payment and things like that. We have a company at Foundation Capital Branch that's involved in payments across many of these regions with very low digital inclusion. And then the other area is in digital education. That's where you're seeing a lot of people, pour money, and I think that's sort of a combo of some traditional venture, more on the corporate, and then even more on the kind of better world folks.
Okay, thanks, Paul. While you were sharing those insights, we have a question from John Morris, which is in the chat bar. He asks, are digitally excluded communities a commercial focus for your clients?
Boy, I'd love to say that would be broadly yes, but I would say it's probably generally no. And what I mean by that is that when we work with a corporation and they are setting up a venture firm, they want to look and sound and feel and perform as much like a top tier Silicon Valley venture firm as they can. And I have a whole talk on just this one topic of, how returns are all correlated up and to the right, because that's where the compensation comes that draws the best people in the world to make investments in whatever they want to invest in, as long as it makes money. And then as you get further and further away from that, then you have less success from the return perspective. So that's kind of point one. Point two is when we find ourselves working with, and we do a limited amount of this, but we find ourselves working with governmental authorities, NGOs, people like that. There's certainly more of a focus there. And then interestingly, if you go into, and I would say particularly in the GCC region, in the Gulf Coast region, particularly with the Saudis, they're funding a lot of digital inclusion type of activity in the Northern Africa and then kind of broadly African region, certainly the Muslim African region. So it's some of the money that's going into programs like this is coming from places that you wouldn't necessarily expect for reasons that you might not expect, which are, in this case, I'd say with the Saudis, it's largely cultural, and then secondarily, it's commercial.
So Paul, on the topic of funding and using the Saudis as an example, or more broadly, the Middle East, you referenced earlier that payment systems and education are two primary flavors for applications that you see going in that are enabling digital inclusivity. Is the funding that you're seeing that is materializing pointed specifically at those types of applications? Are there others? What do you see in terms of preferred applications?
Well, I mean, certainly those are two of the areas that we see. You know, the real pioneers, you could argue, would have been the mobile carriers, right? So they went into those regions and have been, you know, wildly successful in getting mobile phone adoption. Then what needs to follow, of course, is broadband and all the things that we know need to happen. So where the other areas that we see are pretty self-serving for the companies, but they end up having an impact, which is in like energy, mining, extraction, all of the resource intensive industries. Their sources of product tend to be outside of urbane, you know, highly digital areas. And as a consequence, when they come in, they often need to implement, you know, a high degree of new infrastructure to come in and enable that. I mean, one area, you know, one area that we see that we've gotten exposure to is in back in the Gulf region, but in northwestern Saudi Arabia is an area that really had, I mean, it was Bedouin camel herders, right? There were no major cities or none of that. And there's a massive new development that many of you all have heard about called NEOM. It's $1 trillion development. They're putting up thousands of 5G cell towers. They're putting subsea cables. They're doing all these other things because they are trying to build the next Dubai or the next Singapore or wherever it might happen to be in that region. So I think those are the places you see very intense investments, but they're on, I would call, kind of special purpose projects, for lack of a better way to describe it. So energy, extraction, mobile communications, education, payment, these are the places that we're seeing the early inroads that are making it into the least developed regions of the world.
That's interesting. So we have had some experience at Geeks Without Frontiers on projects that relate to what you just set out, and particularly relating to extraction of natural resources. We were funded for two consecutive projects by huge buyers of fish. One was Mars Pet Care. The other, more recently, was Walmart Foundation. And these projects were focused on addressing the practice of forced labor and illegal fishing in the world's commercial fishing fleets. We are interested by the interest in the big purchasers of natural resources as a source of financial support for projects, I think, as you're saying, that go into the communities where these natural resources are originating and where there are significant challenges that these buyers would like to see resolved. So you mentioned energy. Are you seeing this happening in the oil sector, gas, mining? Where is the most activity? And do you think this represents a significant dynamic that could help drive digital inclusivity in some of the world's tougher to reach locations?
Well, I mean, I think much of it has already been done. You know, I think when you think about the known, and yes, it's I would say it's oil and gas are the primary drivers on the energy side. You know, renewables are still a relatively tiny proportion, and much of that is happening in the developed world. And so I'd say if you think of the regions, you know, Nigeria, Middle East, North Slope of Alaska, Canadian tar sands, and other regions around the world, the Venezuelan slope and things like that, then you've seen, those places are as digital and so forth, at least for the companies, as you can imagine. And then often what you see is they'll participate in local schooling, and they'll do other things, partly for the PR value, but partly for, getting more workers who are trained and educated in digital technology and things like that. So yes, I think it's those areas. I suspect over time there'll be new areas that will be created. Certainly medicine is part of what drives some of this, but the difficulty is, in some of these regions is that, there's a burst of funding, and that burst of funding may be around a mine or a dam or an oil campaign, or even around an NGO campaign of building a new hospital, whatever it might happen to be. And it's really sustaining that. It's getting it to where there's a real workable economy. We did a project for Standard Bank of South Africa, to give you an idea. And what they wanted to do was enable what are called, I think they're called spaza shops. They're just a little roadside kiosks that are actually a thriving part of the African economy. And they wanted to kind of allow these folks who were literally handling cash all day, getting robbed and beaten on the way to the bank to try to deposit the cash and so forth. They wanted to create a digital point of sale solution for those communities. And it's, the point of sale part of it is not the problem. The problem is all the other pieces that come together. And so it's, these are just the things that you have to deal with. But Michael had asked the question about the power of innovation for global impact. I think, the work with Standard Bank is kind of an illustration for that. And then the work across many of our clients, Hitachi and folks like Intel and Stanley Black & Decker and Hypertherm and others that we do work with. As I mentioned, much of what they're trying to do is around climate tech and the transition to electric economy. So, we have multiple clients now that are working on trying to build electric charging infrastructure around the world. So that could be another thing, but I think that's going to be a lagging feature, just as electric cars have been a lagging feature in the developed world and have been coming on. But, we see that. We see places like Intel, where we developed a new project for the deaf and hearing impaired, to try to bring them more into the overall economy and the overall society from that perspective. So I think the power of innovation around global impact is potentially huge, and to the extent that we can we have done work in, I would call, kind of second world environments. But there's just so much kind of spade work that needs to be done. Cell towers, basic education, food and water, hygiene, medicine, in some of these regions that this really takes a back seat until you can get some of that stuff started.
So, Paul, you've mentioned several times in the context of innovation and an instrumental role being played to help drive digital inclusivity as well as other services. In addition to wireless, are there other technologies, innovations, to Michael's question, that you're seeing, satellite, fiber, or cloud, artificial intelligence, blockchain? Are there technological innovations that have the potential to drive impact globally that are prominent on your radar screen right now?
Yeah, yes, they are. They're all of those things are sort of enabling technologies. What we tend to get driven towards is a specific solution. For example, for a large energy provider, we created a field service solution for them. So think of it as like a Salesforce.com, but for people who are, the way they described it is that there are over 2 billion people in the world who work and they don't have a desk. And so anybody who's working in a service environment, heating, air conditioning, whatever, oil field, wind farms, anything like that, their ability to do sort of integrated communication, database management, all that kind of stuff is really limited because the other systems have not been set up for that. So that was one where one of our clients who's in the energy world and has significant wind exposure and wind assets basically recognized the need and then asked us to help them develop kind of this new technology. I'd say probably the thing that at the moment right now is one of the highest orders of priority are people understanding and getting into the metaverse.
Hello.
So
Are we on?
Yeah, we're about to, it's about to go.
Welcome aboard.
I think you're on. I think you're on our talk right now, but your talk will be in 3 minutes. So, if you look at, for example, the metaverse. So if you look at places like Neom, where they're going to have 9 million people in a single city in the line, which is one of the projects that's there. 95% of the people that will interact with Neom actually won't visit there. They're gonna interact with it through the metaverse. They're gonna interact through digital technology and through digital communications and various forms of applications and social applications and things like that. So we're seeing that roll out in remote regions. We're seeing that roll out in anything kind of real estate oriented. COVID completely turned upside down the commercial real estate market. So people now are reimagining what they're going to do there. And that's really kind of happening across the world. So those are some of the things that I think are drivers towards sort of the future from that perspective. But it's a mix between the developed world and the less developed world.
Okay. Well, we are at 2 minutes out, and I just wanted to ask one more quick question. And that is, I mentioned at the beginning of this session, Paul, that at N50, we have this project pipeline that is fairly fully loaded with concepts, ideas for projects that all have one thing in common, and that is high impact global potential. And as we continue to work with our partners to curate these projects and hopefully see them come out the back end of that pipeline, are there lessons learned that you have to share on key considerations, key factors to take on board when ideating these projects and moving them through a pipeline towards ultimate implementation?
Yeah, terrific question. So the Mach 49 methodology, which is now memorialized in a new book that's being released from Harvard called The Unicorn Within. This is written by our founder, Linda Yates. It's available on Amazon, and Michael's been kind enough to purchase a bunch of copies, so appreciate that. That basically articulates the methodology, which is ideate, incubate, accelerate, scale. And what we try to do when people are trying to come up with a new concept that they want to roll out in a broad way, we get them to think about the ideation aspect of it. How can you really focus on the highest quality ideas that you're going to do? But then a really key consideration is the phase that we call incubation. So every one of our clients has gone through a 12-week incubation program. During that program, we have what we call a customer development section, and they'll talk to between 200 and 400 customers before they launch a single thing. And that's really, if I had it down to one thing to answer your question, David, it's people, especially technologists, get really excited. They're like, I really get it. I see the product market fit. When I worked with Reed Hastings at Pure Software, he tested Purify, our solution, with hundreds of developers before it ever saw anything remotely close to commercial. And so that's the thing that I would encourage people to do. Find a way to get it out in front of live customers, develop the data, organize the data, and then put yourself in a position where by the time you actually go through the expense and the time of launching something, you've got a very high likelihood it's going to succeed before you even begin.
Excellent. Wow. That's hugely appreciated. It resonates well in as much as a number of the projects that have begun to be implemented that we're involved in. We have listened first to those who are in the community about what their needs are, and then built a project design around that expression of need. And we're going to be hearing one example of those types of communities that have given shape and form to N50 projects. We'll be looking at tribal communities here in a few seconds. Before we go to that, though, I wanted to just applaud your contribution that you've made and shared with us today, Paul. It's been really a pleasure to hear your perspective, and we look forward to continuing this conversation going forward during these very exciting times. So great appreciation, uproariously loud applause digitally.
Here you go.
So thank you for that.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity. You guys take care.
Thanks, Paul.
Bye-bye.
And with that segue,